Welcome to Asia Pacific Week 2022. Asia Pacific Week is an interdisciplinary conference welcoming 80 highly motivated delegates from around the world. Now in its 12th year, Asia Pacific Week continues to be a platform for young people to come together, share ideas, and leave with a greater understanding and appreciation of the challenges facing the Asia and Pacific regions. My name is Anna Kate and I'm the director of this year's conference. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the custodians of the land in which our community lives, studies, and will be hosting the conference from here at the Australian National University in Canberra. We wish to acknowledge and respect the continuing culture, aspirations, and contributions they make to the life of Canberra and the region. Before we hear from our many speakers, we are honoured to be joined today by Wally Bell, a Ngunnawal traditional custodian who will perform a traditional smoking ceremony and welcome to country for the committee and our delegates online.
When you're ready, you can stop. Nango! Okay, so everybody should be nice and cleansed now. That any bad spirit that might be lurking around has now been told to go away. Okay, so the word I was saying was because we need the spiritual connection to be made. So I'm saying to the spirits, arise. And when I finished off, I said another word, nungu, which means see. Arise and see. So they're looking for bad stuff, and when they get if they find any of that, they get rid of it. So that's the cleansing ceremony in itself. So what we'll get into now is the other side of things as well, because as Aboriginal people, we live by different rules and regulations to, well, if you want to call yourself normal society. We used to have a bureaucracy as well. Now, a lot of people used to say that Aboriginal people never had any form of bureaucracy. We were, how do you put it? Native people wandering aimlessly across the landscape. But there's always a reason why we were moving around so often, because we were looking after country. Okay, so this part of the country is Ngunnawal country. Proper pronunciation is Ngunnawal. We've occupied this area for something like 25,000 years, and good old ANU actually did a carbon dating of one of our rock shelter sites called Birragai. So that's how we've arrived at that proven figure. Okay, so but we also believe that we've been here a bit longer than that. I mean, that's the only place I've done any carbon dating on. There used to be an ice age down this way as well, and that went away about 35,000 years ago. So we reckon that we moved in as that ice was receding. We live on an area of something like 17,000 square kilometres. So that means that Ngunnawal country is not just the ACT. Okay, we're out in New South Wales, and we surround the whole of the ACT. We got different clan groups, so we've got 7 different clan groups. My clan group are the Yar people. They now call that place Yass. If you know what Yass is. But I actually grew up just outside of Yass in a tiny little village called Jerawa. That word is our word for running water. It's out there that I learned about being an Aboriginal person on country. And as is our traditional customary practice, we take our younger generations out on country and teach them all about country. And that's what my father did with me. So I learned all about bush food, bush medicine, how to source other forms of food as well, and most importantly, where to find water, because nothing in this planet is going to live without water. So it was important that we knew where all these water sources were. So one of the other most important things about country is the fact that it's covered in waterways. So we have a strong belief in our creator spirit, and we call it many different things. Even within the Ngunnawal people, we call it Bunjabuya or Dadamalan, and they're different names, but they're all for the same creator spirit. Some people call it, around the country, I suppose, it's labelled as being the rainbow serpent or something like that. And we believe in that creator spirit because of the fact that it's a serpent, okay? And when you look at all the waterways around everywhere on the continent of Australia, how do they travel across the land? So everybody, go on. And what's that copying? The way a snake moves across the land, isn't it? That's right. So that's why waterways are closely tied to our cultural beliefs, because we know that our creator spirits made these waterways for us, made all that waterways so that we get green growth and we're able to survive. It provided everything for us. So that in mind, then we also have strong beliefs about where we come from as Aboriginal people, which is the land itself. So all our past generations reside in the land, and we believe that we're put up here on the surface to look after the place for a little while, because our lifespans aren't all that long as Aboriginal people. Used to be pretty short lifespan, but they're starting to get a little bit longer. And when our time was up, then we returned back to the land then, because while we're here, we look after the place. We take care of it. It's our mother, so we look after our mother. Okay. So with other belief systems as well, like I was telling you about the eucalyptus tree, that's our spiritual connection back to the land. And you'll find that in all ceremony that we have, you'll find the women dancing with the eucalyptus, waving it around and all that sort of thing. But because men are also dancing as well, but they're playing instruments like the clapsticks and boomerangs and making noise with those things. They can't hold the eucalyptus, so they actually strap it around their waist. So that's their connection back to the land as well. And you'll also see we're always painted up in ochre. We wear markings on our bodies. And that's, again, because that ochre comes from the land. It's another spiritual connection back to the land that we come from. So we have strong spiritual connection with our country. Aboriginal culture across Australia is quite diversified. We do things here on Ngunnawal country that, say, our neighbouring group down on the coast, the Yuin people, they'll probably do some things that are similar, but they incorporate not only land but sea into their cultural practice. So you can see straight away that cultural practice is going to be quite different. There's lots of similarities, but there's also a big difference as well. Even if you go into, say, Central Australia, for instance, as well, where the Arente people live, well, they got their desert, so different environment again, so you're going to get different belief systems coming out of that. And that's something that a lot of people can't understand about cultural practice. They think we do everything exactly the same, and we most definitely do not. There is, for us as Ngunnawal people with our clan groups, for us to live, quite harmoniously together, we use what we call communal law, LAW sort of stuff. So that, lets us live quite peacefully together without too many fights. Everybody has barneys now and then about things. But for all Aboriginal people right across Australia then, we all abide by what we call our traditional customary law, LORE. Now, again, because our cultural practice is different, that law is also slightly different as well. So, that law dictates to us as Aboriginal people what we have to do while we're in country. So, one of the things that we all have to do under that law is welcome people onto country. So a lot of people think that, like I said, we do everything exactly the same. But that law is different then, and that means that we do things differently as well. So what we're going to do here on Ngunnawal country is going to be quite different to Central Australia or even Western Australia. We again, as different clan groups, 7 different clan groups, we have little variations in the way we do welcomes as well. But that's to be expected, like everything can't be carbon copied. So what I do as a member of the Ya people, or from the Ngunnawal people, is we welcome you on the country, but we also have an obligation under that law to make sure that you're looked after and cared for while you're in country as well. So we offer up protection for you in 2 ways. We're going to look after you in a physical sense, and we're going to look after you in a spiritual sense. Okay? Now then, the physical part of the protection is going to be done by what we call our spirit of the land, which means that as you're actually treading foot on country, walking around here on Ngunnawal country, the spirit of the land looks out to make sure that nothing really bad happens to you. I mean, they're going to accept the fact that you're going to have a slip and a fall here and there and maybe a twisted ankle or something, but that you want to make sure that nothing really bad happens to you. The spiritual protection is going to be taken care of by our ancestral spirits. I've already mentioned them already, that there are our past generations that now reside in the land. So what they do, again, like they help me here with the smoking, and they're going to help me again with the welcome by, again, checking out your auras to make sure it is really clean. So they're, again, looking for bad spirit that might be latched onto you. And if they do find it, they just get rid of it. How do I get those spirits to join me in welcoming you guys on the country? Is, again, I make a little bit of noise with my clapsticks, and then I call for those spirits, both the spirit of the land and our ancestral spirits, to come and join me and welcome you on the country, and then looking after you while you're here. Okay? So, here we go again with the sticks. My being an animal man, and like I work on country a lot, so I have really strong ties with my country. I can feel the presence of those spirits now. Hopefully you can too. Be good if you can. Well, as I said then, the spirit of the land now will look after you as you're walking around on country. Our ancestral spirits then, they're looking at everybody again, making sure that there's still no bad spirit around that's maybe still remaining there, little bits of it, so they're going to grab hold of it, toss it off country, get rid of it. We don't want it here because we don't want it to affect you as a person, and we certainly don't want it to affect the land that you're on. The spirits then ask that you do two things while you're on country. First one, important one, respect this place that you're in. So look after it and care for it, as we have done for thousands of years. Second thing they want you to do is to also respect and be kind and courteous to other people that you meet while you're on country. So if you do these two things for us, the spirits will then harmonise with your stay on Ngunnawal country. So may the spirits be with you today, tomorrow and for always. I'll finish the welcome with some words in language. Dalawa nunna, dalawa nunol. Yangu nalawari, dunamayan. Nanaganawali. Yomalondi. This land is Ngunnawal land. We all come together today to listen. Welcome. John Yumaba, thank you.
Thank you, Wally, for performing the traditional smoking ceremony and welcome to country for us. We are grateful for welcoming us onto the land and your willingness to share your insights about the culture and heritage. The Asia and Pacific regions are diverse, dynamic, and ever-evolving. Under this year's theme, Pathways to Transformation, Resilience in an Age of Uncertainty, through exploring the challenges facing the Asia and Pacific regions, we hope to embolden you each to challenge the status quo, by seeking innovative, outside-the-box approaches to addressing regional issues. Despite being so often excluded from the forums of power, I believe there is a growing recognition that young people are not simply victims, but agents and leaders of change. More and more youth are demonstrating that, particularly with the power of social media today, you don't need to be in powerful positions to drive change. Youth are at the centre of social change movements across the Asia and Pacific regions today, and it's no coincidence. The youth of today are increasingly being called upon to show leadership in all manners of important issues. This week, you'll dive into a series of important topics, including social activism, climate change, soft power and popular culture, women in diplomacy, COVID and its economic and health repercussions, and emerging technologies, including in space, cyber, and the AI realms. I urge each of you to seize this opportunity to listen and learn, not only from the many distinguished speakers that we've arranged for you, but also your fellow delegates. I'd now like to introduce the distinguished speakers for this ceremony. It is my great pleasure that we welcome Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, Professor Helen Sullivan, Academic Course Convener of Asia Pacific Week, Professor Katerina Teaiwa, and our keynote speaker for this ceremony, Moemoana Schwenke. Samoan born and New Zealand and Australia raised, Moemoana was named the Wollongong Local Woman of the Year for 2022 for her youth leadership, climate activism, and dedication to promoting Samoan and Pacific Islander culture amongst her community. Alongside her creative and academic pursuits, Moemoana is active with the Pacific Climate Warriors organisation and has represented the Pacific Island nations last year at the COP26 Climate Conference in Glasgow. Moemoana is also one of the few females in the world able to perform the suawafi, a traditional Samoan dance. Welcome, Moemoana.
Fa'atalofa atu I le paia ma le mamalu o lo'o mai moa ma fa'afonga mai. Oa ua Moemoana Safa'atoa Schwenke. Moemoana meaning sleeping ocean, and I'd ask that you picture that as I speak. I hail from the beautiful island of Samoa in the heart of the Pacific, from the villages of Auala and Matavai in Sava'i and Vauala. In these places, the land, the ocean, and the people have a connected heartbeat. The land, the ocean, and the people are like my roots that firmly ground my identity, and I know without those three things, I wouldn't be here today. I am deeply humbled for the invitation to speak to you and be a part of the closing ceremony of the Australian National University's 2022 Asia Pacific Week. I extend my deep appreciation for the institutions that continue to elevate, celebrate, and acknowledge the unique, rich, and irreplaceable cultures in Asia and the Pacific. I am a performance artist, emerging writer and director, environmental advocate, student at the University of Wollongong, and tutor here at Matavai Pacific Cultural Arts, based in Sydney, Australia. My family's cultural centre, Matavai, aims to promote the positive fundamentals of Pacific culture through creative arts, dance, music, and language. Often my people have major odds stacked against them because of the colour of their skin, their cultural backgrounds, the colonial ideologies that prevail through negative stereotypes, and so much more. Reconnecting the Australian Pacific community with their culture is a key goal of Matavai, which is achieved through the passing down of cultural art forms and traditions. Travelling internationally to promote the Pacific has been an honour and a blessing, and empowering youth to mobilise their talents to counteract the social, environmental and political issues that affect the Pacific is a legacy that I wish to leave. The theme of pathways to transformation, resilience in an age of uncertainty can be meaningfully interpreted in many ways. The first thing I think of when I hear resilience is my ancestors navigating through uncharted waters, travelling through the largest and deepest ocean in the world to find island kingdoms amongst them. Today, while COVID-19 has brought forth feelings of fear, isolation and instability, it has also revealed to all of us how resilient we are and have always been. Speaking of resilient, I'd like to speak to the resilience of frontline communities in the Pacific who face the worst effects of the climate crisis. In the Pacific, in Samoa, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, and 20,000 plus Pacific Islands, the ocean, exacerbated by climate change, is creeping closer every day. A very well-respected Samoan chief and an uncle to me wrote this statement living on the front lines in Samoa. O lea ta uto ia sa o le vau filifili. Ina ne'i o upa o tia o na to ia leo au I mala o le vau sa. Pe musu vau sa, pe musu va fo'i le asa. O na felelei lea o le fui fui o le seunga. E whai ngata le mamalu lele, e wha olo olo ngata. Aua o te le ngā wha tauli maina, pe o te whai tau fo'i wha alofi lima. Aua sa fo'i le sami, sa le lau ele, sa le vau. Aua o lea, e mamalu lea itu o lea oa, I le mata I sau o le fuafuanga. Tu launa la ia o le whaafofonga tai o le lalulangi. Ai se I o tātou a le anga I le sosia o le fuafuanga, a le atua sili ese. Ea ua whai mō tātou a inga, mamalusanga o tangata soifua uma o le lalulangi. In English, this means, leave the sacredness of the environment alone. If you touch, disturb, interfere, then you are going to have to face the consequences. I cannot afford to explain what the consequences are, like reading the palm of my hand. If the environment is destroyed, I cannot imagine all the problems we will face. The ocean is sacred, it is out of bounds. The forest is sacred, it is out of bounds. The land is sacred, it is out of bounds. Mata Isau as the creator, Fuafuanga as the creation, Aitu as the spirit of the forest. You don't want to make noise in the out-of-bound area of the earth. You don't want to wake the giant up, because when the giant wakes, he will do something that we cannot fathom. Let us sit down and enjoy the deliberation and the blessing of God's creation that we call home, and understand that there are consequences for touching, disturbing, and interfering with the sacredness of the environment. I'm a fire dancer. The cultural art is called sivafi in Samoa, and it is performed with a single hook-shaped weapon that is called a nifo'oti. The natural element of fire is put on both ends of this weapon, and so we literally execute movements with a natural element. It's performed all around the world for entertainment, for cultural fulfillment, for fun, but for me, it's a portal into the past to learn more about my history and culture, and a visual representation of the islands that I'm trying to protect. It's my connection to the past that gives meaning to the present and will help me to better navigate my future. My culture has taught me how to be a warrior, how to be resilient. To continue, there's a legend in my district about one of the greatest warriors of Samoa, her name was Nafanua. She disguised herself as a man and fought for the protection of her village with a weapon that looked very similar to that of a nifo'oti. In one of the most trying times in my life, my family took a trip back home and we stood on the same ground she would have stood on, visited the cave she would have lived in, and walked through the forest she would have taken refuge in during her battles. Returning to my land, the whanua, was a revelation to me, the land that has a heartbeat, breathed strength back into me, and after that, I turned pain into power by honoring Nafanua and expressing my deep love for the Pacific when I performed at the World Fire Knife Championships in Hawaii, a dream of mine. Where I performed actually has great significance, the Polynesian Cultural Center. Millions of tourists visit this place every single year in search of something that I believe only Pacific people can give. Pacific people put on a good show. We are natural entertainers, we are generous, we bring joy to people, hospitality, and we live by the most sacred cultural values. People, they come, buy, build, and bring tourists onto our islands. But right now, when there is drought, or too many cyclones, when the sea levels are rising too high, when the fish start dying, when the pollution is overwhelming, you cannot evacuate. You must act in the same way Mother Earth gives us strength we must breathe strength back into her, and we must pay that forward, repairing her, giving to her in the same way she gives to us. That's what the Indigenous protectors of my home do every single day, protect and sustain the land, viewing land as a source of life, rather than a key component to capitalism. Now, there was a time over 100 years ago, during European colonial conquest into the Pacific, when it seemed that Pacific Island way of life, and Pacific people for that matter, would cease to exist. Imagine at that time, for my ancestors, during colonialism, everything that they valued and loved suddenly stripped and stolen from them, for someone to reap the resources, make money from, and flaunt power over. But here we are, Pacific people, islands, and our oceans still stand strong. I have and will always have a home to return back to if we can halt the climate emergency. Indigenous people of the Pacific know their survival as distinct people depends on the survival of the Pacific itself. First world nations must listen, learn, and act on what Pacific Islanders have always known for millennia. Upon the survival of the Pacific depends the survival of the world. The fight for climate justice is not only in the interests of Pacific or Indigenous people, it affects all people of this world. If you pictured a sleeping ocean at the beginning of this video, now picture a violent one, crashing over lands that carry my culture, washing over my ancestors' burial grounds, and my people becoming climate refugees because of this. Like my uncle who warns us against waking up the giant of the earth, as the consequences are unimaginable. Like my family in Sava'i who listen so carefully to natural elements in order to make important decisions. We need not look far before we see the earth is already sending us important messages. Accelerated sea level rise, extreme weather patterns, and exacerbated natural disasters. If you consider the vastness of this universe, Earth is like the size of a small canoe. If the canoe is sinking, then we all are to sink together. If our islands in the Pacific are to be devoured by a rising sea, the entire planet should expect this future too. The giant is waking, the winds are accumulating, the seas are rising, and there's no more time to wait. We, you and I, have a whole life in front of us. A whole life in front of you, and that life can birth wonders into this world. More love, more compassion, more ideas, more activism, more solutions, more inventions, more cures, and more decisions. My islands are counting on it. There's never been a more urgent need or time for you to take up more space, fill more decision-making rooms, to help save my islands. With all my heart, whaawhitai tele lava to the Australian National University for having me for this year's Asia Pacific Week. And as we say in Samoa, Chihu!
Hello and welcome delegates. I'm Professor Helen Sullivan and I am the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University here in Canberra. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am meeting with you today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are each joining us, both nationally and internationally. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Asia Pacific Week conference. Asia Pacific Week has an important history, not only in the life of the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU, but also internationally. Drawing in highly engaged youth such as yourself from across all corners of the world, Asia Pacific Week seeks to provide an unrivaled opportunity for young leaders to come together, share ideas and engage in meaningful conversations about the security and prosperity of the Asia and Pacific regions. It also seeks to promote cross-cultural understanding, not solely through dialogue, but also through education. This week, you will take part in cultural workshops, including Pacific dance, Chinese calligraphy, and language tasters. The challenges facing the Asia-Pacific regions today are increasingly complex, interconnected, and driven by competing political, social, and economic forces. This year's conference theme, Pathways to Transformation, Resilience in an Age of Uncertainty, aims to challenge you each into synthesizing and exploring new and innovative approaches to tackling real-world issues amidst an era of change and uncertainty. Under the guidance of cutting-edge panelists, keynote speakers, and subject specialists, you'll be exploring important themes and topical issues this week, including the climate crisis, social activism, women in diplomacy, emerging technologies, including in the realms of space and cyberspace, the economic and social repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the evolving nature of soft power and popular culture in Asia and the Pacific. Navigating your time in the conference, I challenge you all to ask thought-provoking questions, seek to listen to and understand one another carefully, and strive to engage in meaningful and challenging conversations. It is my hope that the disciplinary breadth and depth of this week's conference will push each of you out of your comfort zones, spark intellectually stimulating and broad discussions, and ignite passions you may not have been otherwise aware of. Above all, I hope this week leaves you with a greater appreciation and understanding of the challenges facing Asia and the Pacific, and a refreshed sense of purpose in carving out your own role in shaping the future of these important regions. Thank you.
Kamna Maori and Nisambula Vinaka, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that we in Canberra are gathered on Aboriginal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and that these lands were stolen from the traditional owners through the colonisation of the continent. I acknowledge Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders and descendants who are the traditional custodians of the place we live and work in Canberra. I'm Professor Katerina Teaiwa, the academic convener of Asia Pacific Week here in the College of Asia and the Pacific. I've worked with students who've run this wonderful international conference ever since it went hybrid in 2020. And it's been amazing to watch the organizing committee work together, brainstorm, plan, troubleshoot, innovate, design, redesign, and execute this complex event over the last 3 years. Director Anna Kate, her deputies Isabella and Kira, and the whole team have done a fantastic job putting together what we all hope will be an inspiring 2022 Asia Pacific Week. This year's theme, Pathways to Transformation, Resilience in an Age of Uncertainty, is relevant in many ways for everyday life and the many challenging individual, family, community, local, regional, and global issues we increasingly face. In my area of research and teaching in Pacific Studies at the ANU, we explore the ways in which Pacific Islanders have been transformed by and constantly negotiate many forces that have both devastated and brought opportunities to Pacific communities. This has been going on since the 1500s in some parts of our region, so I'm regularly reminding my students and colleagues that it's critical to learn from the past in order to make decisions and choices about the present and future. For example, many islanders have had their cultures, spiritual and value systems, and everyday lives derailed by the interests and priorities of competing global empires. This includes during periods of intense missionization by various churches, the introduction of foreign diseases that's wiped out many populations, the devastation of World War II, and during Allied and Japanese occupation. In that period, nuclear testing by Britain, the US, and France, the ongoing extraction and trade in Pacific minerals, fisheries, forests, and resources, the competition for power between China, Taiwan, Australia, and the US, and the continuing movements for sovereignty and self-determination by Indigenous peoples in West Papua, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Guam, Hawaii, and other islands. There's so much to learn, and I believe Pacific Island Studies is something that needs to be taught in Australia and across our regions at all levels of study, from primary to tertiary education. When we're talking about resilience today, following the pandemic and the increasing effects of climate change, we should be engaging and honoring the resilience of those who have come before us, those who already had their worlds turned upside down and continue to find critical and creative ways to survive and thrive. The peoples of Asia and the Pacific are the products of those who have conquered and changed others, as well as those who have survived these empires. Resilience for me then is in understanding these complexities and getting through challenges by facing the need for historical justice and passing on important lessons to the next generations. Asia Pacific Week creates a space for all of us to hear from scholars, policymakers, artists, activists, and others about all of these issues, and gives us a space to think critically about how we might form our own ideas about the best pathways forward. What does resilience and transformation mean to you and your families, friends, colleagues, and communities? Have you considered what it means not just in political or economic or scientific terms, but in environmental, embodied, spiritual, health, well-being, and behavioral ways? I hope that during this conference, there is space for you to consider all of these and help shape a more just and transformative future for all of us. All the best in the conference, Kampasin Rapa and Vinaka Vakalemusara.
That brings us to the end of our opening ceremony. Thank you to each of the speakers for joining us, and welcome again to Asia Pacific Week 2022. We now invite you to join us online to unpack your delegate goodies before we dive into our first panel of the week. See you very soon.